Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all of you to our debate on e-commerce or digital trade or both, what's negotiated at the WTO in Geneva. Today's debate is hosted by EIF steering committee member Miapetra Kumpula-Natri, who is an MEP from the S&D group from Finland, a member of the ITRE committee, but also vice chair of the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age and of the Delegation of Relations with the United States. Welcome, Miapetra, and thank you very much for taking the lead on this debate at our forum. Today, we're also joined by three experts to discuss the range of issues that are under discussion in these negotiations amongst 86 WTO members. They will help us understand what is less controversial, what is more complex to resolve, and of course, what the EU aims to achieve with these negotiations. A warm welcome to our speakers, starting with Christophe Kiener, Acting Director at DG Trade, the European Commission. He is currently heading the European Commission's unit in charge of services and digital trade, and he's leading the EU's negotiation team in the WTO negotiations on e-commerce. We're also joined by Pascal Kerneis, Managing Director at the European Services Forum since 1999, if I'm not mistaken. And those of you who have watched the movie The Brussels Business may have recognized him already, which I did, by the way. We're also joined by Marilia Maciel, who is Digital Policy Senior Researcher at DiploFoundation. It's a non-governmental organization specialized in capacity development in the field of internet governance and digital policy. Thank you all very much for joining us. As you know, after listening to our speakers, there will be an exchange of views with the audience, which will take place in the Q&A session. But now we'll start with our panel. I'll leave the floor to our MEP, Miapetra Kumpula-Natri, for her opening remarks. Miapetra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you all for taking part in this discussion about the WTO e-commerce joint statement initiative. As a Parliament standing rapporteur for these negotiations in the INTA committee, I want to start by saying that the Parliament firmly supports these negotiations and hopes for ambition and comprehensive outcome. The European Union is the world's #1 exporter of services, and 48% of services are digital. It is our interest to work for an open digital market and for global rules that support interests of our companies, consumers, and workers in those markets. While digital trade is still not nearly as important as goods trade, its importance is growing fast and has taken a giant leap forward in the past year of COVID. The fact ever since the global financial crisis, goods trade had been slowing down, while the digital trade in what the OECD calls information industries has been speeding up. Thereby, globalization is becoming more and more digital and information intensive. How to regulate the global digital economy is a big question, and WTO e-commerce JSI can certainly be part of the answers. Jurisdictions around the world, including our EU, are busy developing new rules for the digital economy, which has until recently largely been unregulated. It is clear that similar public policy objectives that have been addressed in the traditional economy will need to be addressed in the digital economy. That's why EU is pursuing DSA, DMA, GGA, and the new AI regulation, to name just a few of our own initiatives. While the EU is developing its digital rules in such a way that we will remain open to the rest of the world, it is clear that many others are maybe not. Instead, many countries are using new digital regulations to restrict foreign competition. Forced data localization practices are the tip of the iceberg that the new corp of protectionist digital measures. I see the WTO e-commerce GSI as the opportunity for all the main players to agree amongst themselves to keep each other's market open for digital trade and jointly agree on the basic rules governing digital trade. At the moment, 86 countries would cover a lot. Thereby, the GSI can be an instrument enabling the new stage of globalization to proceed, enabling the trade of the information industry to one day eclipse the trade of the manufacturing industries. While openness should be the key objective, we need to make it clear in the arrangements that non-discriminatory justified regulation on digital markets will continue to be allowed. In the negotiation, we have had some good progress late, but I will leave that to Kiener, who is our negotiator from the European Commission and will be speaking here, and I'm very happy to welcome him. And I think the most difficult negotiations are still ahead of us, and it will not be easy, maybe. It's clear that some of the GSI participants even, and not everybody is on the board, but also some participating are not maybe committed enough for ambitious outcome. I think we cannot accept an outcome that doesn't include some rules of the data flow, source code, and permanent moratorium of the custom duties. Without these elements, the agreement cannot sufficiently guarantee the openness of the digital trade, which is maybe the most important part of this try to make the agreement. I hope substantial progress can be made also by ministers in November MC12, and we need a new impetus for the talks to then be concluded soon after. I believe that we need to make it clear for those slowing down the negotiation that unless they promptly commit to an ambitious outcome, we and the others that are committed will move forward without them. And actually, we see bilateral trade agreements happening all the time and different agreements on the digital cooperation as well. We should frame it as a choice between one, inclusive global rules that allow everyone to reap the benefits increase in digital trade, or two, exclusive rules that will make the benefits occur to selected few only. I don't see other way intensify all actors to an open and ambitious outcome. Perhaps the speakers can elaborate that. In any case, we cannot allow this negotiation to become another 20-year WTO process that may or may not be concluded in the end. Too much is at stake, and this is acute and happening, the digitalization now. If we cannot agree on the digital rules soon, an increase in number and of new barriers to the digital trade will have to be put in place, and growth of the digital trade might run out of stream. That would be a huge loss for companies, workers, and consumers for the using the new kind of services. So let's push for an ambitious agreement that will enable us to re-up the benefits of the globalization, and is it moving into the next information-intensive phase that's full of opportunities. I welcome the speakers to continue from here.
Thank you very much to Miapetra Kumpula-Natri for opening and setting the scene. As she said, we are joined by the European Commission Christophe Kiener, who is heading the negotiations on the EU side, and we look forward to hearing from him on the state of play of the negotiations.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Miapetra, for your kind words of support. Let me start perhaps by seeking to respond to the very question that features as the title to this session. What is the difference between e-commerce and digital trade? And perhaps disappointingly say that there is no difference as far as we are concerned. The EU prefers to use the word digital trade because electronic commerce is traditionally associated more with selling goods on the internet. And in our view, digital trade therefore expresses much better the broader scope that we see in those negotiations, for example, covering also data flows, consumer protection. And that is in fact why the European Union uses the terms digital trade in all of its recent free trade agreements, like the one we recently concluded with the United Kingdom, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Now, in the WTO, there is a definition of electronic commerce under the WTO Work Program on Electronic Commerce, and it's meant to refer to the production, distribution, marketing, sale, or delivery of both goods and services by electronic means. The key issue here, I think, which is important to understand, is that whether you talk about electronic commerce or about digital trade, you talk about trade that is being enabled by electronic means, and this relates both to trade in goods and to trade in services. Now, even if the WTO adopted a work program on electronic commerce already back in 1998, multilateral negotiations on the topic never took off in reality. We, for once, as European Union, again attempted to negotiate multilaterally on electronic commerce prior to the ministerial conference that took place in 2017 in Buenos Aires. But that attempt was again blocked by countries like India and South Africa, who already at the time insisted that no negotiations on new issues could take place before the Doha round could be fully completed, particularly when it comes to agriculture, and that remains their position up to now. Now, it is precisely to try and end this deadlock that after more than 20 years of discussions on electronic commerce, so much for a new issue, so to speak, a group of 70 WTO members adopted a joint statement in Buenos Aires in 2017 to start exploratory talks on possible WTO negotiations on electronic commerce. Now, we first started with 1 full year of exploratory talks, addressing all the issues and mapping the universe of those potential negotiations. And a year later, or about a year later, in January 2019, a group of 76 countries signed up to start formal negotiations on e-commerce. And that's a group that from the outset, beyond the European Union, Australia, Japan, and Singapore, because those 3 countries are the co-conveners, the co-chairs of these negotiations. This group from the outset contained the US, China, Russia, or Brazil, for example. Now, today, as Miapetra said, there are 86 official participants, but this is an open and transparent negotiating framework, and any other WTO member can actually join. And we've seen many cases of developing countries, for example, African countries, taking a very active part in the ongoing negotiations on many issues without actually being formally part of that group. I'm thinking of a country like Senegal, for example. Now, my main point for today is that these negotiations have very important systemic implications for the WTO. If they succeed, they will demonstrate that the organization continues to be relevant for international rulemaking in the 21st century. If they fail, of course, or if they drag on for so long, as Miapetra was saying, 20 years, they would simply demonstrate the opposite, that the WTO is not relevant for rulemaking. Turning to the agenda for those negotiations, there are, about 40 issues that are on the table. They can be clustered one way or the others, but let me just briefly go through a number of main themes. We first negotiate on the facilitation of electronic transactions, issues like electronic signature. We negotiate on the facilitation of digital trade as such. We have provisions, for example, on paperless trading. We're also negotiating on the issue of customs duties on electronic transmissions. Of course, data flows, data localization measures, and privacy are going to constitute an important part of this negotiation, just like, for example, provisions on consumer protection, spam, the protection of source codes against mandatory disclosures, but also negotiations on market access for both goods and services, and also telecommunication services in terms of rules. And we're trying to update an existing WTO reference paper in those negotiations. Now, not all these issues carry equal weight when it comes to their importance, of course, and it's clear that things like data flows, source code, customs duties on electronic transmission, and market access stand out from the issue from the perspective of their economic importance. But they also stand out for many of those in terms of the sensitivity that they may have at political level. If you think of, the need for the EU certainly to ensure that privacy, the right to personal data protection be fully retained, let alone the more general right to regulate on all issues that should also be retained. So it goes without saying that these negotiations are important economically, but that they also can be quite sensitive, and which is why in the Commission, DG Trade is conducting these negotiations in very close cooperation with other line DGs, so to speak. Now, as I said, for us, a very important objective is to achieve a secured online environment for both consumers and companies that are trading digitally, and preserve policy space wherever we need to have that. We need to have there. Sorry. Now, after 2.5 years of negotiations, we have on the table a so-called consolidated text, which is more a bit of a consolidation of existing text proposals. It is still about 90 pages long. It has plenty of alternatives, brackets, etc. It is officially a negotiating document, therefore confidential, but has been leaked and can be found on the internet, therefore. One element that is clearly hindering progress is that after several formal rounds that could be held in a normal negotiating environment, since March of last year, we've of course had to move into an online negotiating format. So we're having a lot of negotiations in small groups, because of course when you're using video technology, negotiating with 86 countries in one room is a little bit difficult. But we regularly have plenary sessions, and we will, for example, have another plenary session next week on the 20th of May, devoted in particular to initiating negotiations also on data flows. Now, despite the constructive participation by most countries, progress is obviously slower in this type of format, but it's also true that it's interesting, so to speak, to be negotiating in a virtual meeting room, both with the United States, China, Russia, the EU, of course, and a number of countries that do not necessarily share the same views on all of those very technical but sometimes politically sensitive issues. So it's also clear that we're gradually entering into a moment where there is a need to start addressing more difficult issues, but we're also starting to hit the wall in terms of more technical, our technical capacity to advance on certain provisions. We have, for the time being, consolidated texts, and I mean by that, we have completed the negotiations on two sets of technical provisions: electronic signature and protection against spam. These are clearly very important issues, but perhaps not the most important ones from an economic perspective. What is key for the credibility of this negotiating process is that we take significant step by the next WTO Ministerial Conference, which will take place between the end of November and the beginning of December this year in Geneva, if all goes well, So the objective will be by then to come to a situation where we have a more streamlined text compared to what we have now, and probably another joint statement by ministers who would encourage negotiators to turn their attention to more difficult issues and potentially try and conclude the negotiations by a given date, which would then, of course, by definition, be after the ministerial meeting of this year, because it's clear that it won't be, unfortunately, possible to conclude already this year. But a solid progress report, a good political message by ministers would be a very good outcome for our work, in view in particular of the difficult conditions we operate in. Now I'll stop here, but I will obviously be very happy to try and respond to any questions that you may have later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christophe, for this very clear overview and update on the negotiations, which, as you said, are very important economically, but also sensitive ones. And to a certain extent, the relevance of the WTO itself will depend on their success. We'll now hear from Pascal Kerneis with the European Services Forum.
Thank you very much, Maria Rosa, and thank you for the Internet Forum for inviting me to this event, and for Miapetra for sponsoring this event. I think it's a very important subject, and the global digital economy needs to take place. And the idea of moving into this negotiation is to improve international governance of digital services. Thank you very much to Christophe as well, as chief negotiator. Thank you for the state of play. I mean, of course, the European Services Forum is working closely with you and the Intercommittee on this issue from the very beginning. For those who maybe do not know well the European Services Forum, we are an organization representing the interest of all services sectors interested into international trade and investment negotiations. And we have developed already 2 years ago a position paper for these negotiations on WTO on the so-called joint statement initiative on e-commerce. To respond also to the question, we certainly prefer to have digital trade, which is much more encompassing the whole digital economy. Sometimes e-commerce can have a connotation of only a limited part of the digital economy, and people might think that it is more about B2C, so business to consumer, which of course the rules for an international agreement will cover the whole digital economy. 71 countries, as Christophe mentioned, have started these negotiations. Now there is 86, so I think we are above 80% of global trade, which would be covered if all of these countries will sign an agreement. Interesting maybe to note which countries have not signed up, which is India and South Africa as a bigger country, part of, I would say, G20, but also a long list of African countries and LDCs have not yet part of it. 6 African countries are now part of it, but still 48 or more countries are not in. If we would like, as this is certainly our wish to use this agreement to diminish the digital divide, we will of course have to bring more countries on board in due time. The EU has already some e-commerce or digital chapter in its own FTAs, and I think that is important to say. We have signed with Canada, Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, Mexico, and recently with the United Kingdom. We are still negotiating, Christophe is negotiating with Australia and New Zealand, Indonesia, and others. So we have now a good basis to go forward, and the EU has put forward its proposal that it is using in its own bilaterals into the WTO. Let me run through explaining what we believe the business is willing to have in these negotiations by going through 6 main elements that we consider as very important into looking at these negotiations. The first one, I think I will label it a facilitate trade and build digital trust, which means that it is, as Christophe mentioned, and some texts are already nearly finalized on this issue, e-authentication, e-signature, fight against spam, I think are already finished. Now there is still work moving on with the negotiators to find disciplines on mutual recognition of digital entities, to be sure that everybody understand and recognize what is legally possible. E-invoicing, the consumer protection, paperless trading, the express shipment for e-commerce, the facilitation of e-payment, also looking at open government data, cybersecurity. All of these needs to be taken on board, and if that would be a core text of already these new disciplines, that would be a very good basis for a new agreement on WTO rules on e-commerce. Now, the second aspect that I'm looking at is we would like these negotiations to improve commitments in regulatory disciplines. I mean, disciplines related to digital services. And I'm thinking here about what Christophe reminded us about the reference paper on basic telecom, which is now nearly 25 years old. The regulatory environment in everything related to digital, not only telecom, has now very much involved. And I think it would be very important to review this proposal and to include not only basic telecom, but everything related to digital trade in this new reference paper. But unfortunately, only the EU and last month, EU, Norway, Ukraine and the UK have tabled a proposal for a new reference paper, but we look forward to see other countries joining on and pushing for something like that. Linked to this is also if we have good disciplines, but the disciplines would apply only to the existing commitments taken by the countries, which are 25 years old, this will not be sufficient. So we hope that during these talks, some countries would accept to take new market access negotiations onwards and take new commitments into, let's say, e-commerce or computer-related services, everything linked to digital trade. My third aspect is something which is also very important. It's looking for no custom duties on electronic transactions. Here, as Christophe explained, we have the WTO e-commerce program since 1998, which is ongoing. That is into the WTO ambit. The GSI is not encompassing all WTO members. We hope that it will be possible with all the signatory to have a permanent ban on the custom duties on electronic transactions. But unfortunately, as you may know, India and South Africa and Namibia are now saying that this moratorium should be ended. So we will see what will happen at the next ministerial, but at least in the GSI, that those signing countries should commit to a permanent ban. The fourth issue, also important, is what I will label the protection of the intellectual property rights. I'm thinking here about the discipline should store a ban that any government should not be allowed to ask for a requirement to get access to software source code and to algorithm. These are really important, and if we want to continue to spare an innovation in digital economy, these rights need really to be protected. The fifth aspect is no discrimination against digital product. That is something that the members of the TPP, what I'm calling the TPP 12, which is a comprehensive partnership Trans-Pacific agreement, is plus the United States. These countries are pushing for labeled of an article for non-discrimination against digital product. And here in the European Union, we have a problem with this because of the fact that in Europe, we consider we cannot be digital and product at the same time. Either you're digital and it's a service, or you're a product and it is a physical good. And that is a long history behind this. I'm not going to go into the details, but the idea of the EU wanted here is to protect cultural diversity. But if we look at what has these countries adopted in these non-discrimination against digital product, they actually allow for exception for broadcasting, and they allow for subsidies to have cultural diversity production. And that is clear in the US, which has a very strong protection of their broadcast services. And in the USMCA, Quebec has been allowed to continue to subsidize French-speaking production. So it seems that a compromise should be feasible, provided that we don't go into a too much dogmatic position, and then we might have difficulties. The last one, the last issue is probably the most important one. And I'm glad to hear Christophe saying that next week they're going to start or initiate discussion on this issue. This is about cross-border data flow. This is where we will see whether the WTO is able to negotiate. The first issue I mentioned are very important, but let's say they are expected to be accepted by most of the countries because they are already enshrining most of the domestic regulation. If we want the WTO to be really moving into dynamic, modern negotiating function for new agreement for the future, this agreement will need to tackle cross-border data flow issues. Let me say here that essentially what we're looking at is banning localization requirement and making the data to move as freely as possible. Here we have three camps. One is what I will call those who want to control data. Those who want, for political reason, for sovereignty reason, for protectionist reason, they want to be able to control the data in their own territory, and that will be contrary to the free flow of data. So I'm thinking here about China, Russia, Vietnam, Indonesia maybe. So these countries want to be able to control. India in a bit also cover in this one. So that would be probably complicated for these countries to take data flow, cross-border data flow commitment. And then we have two other camps. One is the EU, and what I will say is a satellite of the EU. And the other one would be the US and the CPTPP members. These countries, these two blocks, I think agree on the principle that they are willing to have a ban on localization requirement. But the EU is saying we have nevertheless to be able to have very strict regulation on allowing to protect data flow, to protect personal data, sorry. So the famous GDPR. And the US countries and the like would put first the principle of free flow of data, accepting eventually few exceptions. The problem in the EU is that now we have considered that data protection, personal data protection, is a fundamental human right, and a fundamental human right, it is not possible to have any conditionality to protect the human rights. And therefore, the language used in a TPP is saying, yes, you can have protection of data because it is a legitimate public policy objective. But then there is a conditionality, which is as long that there is no unjustifiable discrimination or disguised restriction on trade. And this is where we will need to find a compromise. Now, I don't know whether some of you are following what's happening in the Parliament today, but there is a link, and that is in the Libre Committee. They have decided that the EU-UK adequacy decision is not good enough to protect data. The UK being a country leaving the EU and have legislation on data protection which is equivalent to GDPR, it is sending a very wrong signal that actually the European Union will be able or will not be able to actually accept data coming from elsewhere and not allowing the data of European citizens going to be sent outside the EU. That is really, I think, a problem. If the EU is toughening very much and not willing at all to move at making any possibility of compromise into this text, I guess it's going to be very complicated. I'm going to stop here, just to say that, of course, as a conclusion, we hope very much that by the end of this year, in the 12th Ministerial Conference of WTO, we will have a strong recommendation by the ministers to continue to negotiate, and that Christophe and his colleagues would have been able to have a streamlined text of this consolidated text. So maybe to open up the debate, because we have three camps. If we want to be able to move on, maybe at a point in time, if we want to be able to have an agreement, even if it is not covering all WTO members, we might think about going of a two-tier approach to have different level of commitment, but at least that's something we'll move on. But that is just to open up the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pascal. The need to move on and move forward and modernize what was perhaps agreed upon 25 years ago is clear, and we look forward to the future developments on all various fronts, including the cross-border data flows, of course. We'll now hear from Marilia Maciel with DiploFoundation. Last but not least, Marilia, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, for the European Internet Forum, for the invitation to be here and to host this session today. And when we were preparing this session, we were discussing the angle that I should take coming from academia and civil society, and it was suggested to me that I could take a development perspective on these discussions. And I think it was a very happy idea because, being Brazilian born, I am very sensitive to these discussions. And DiploFoundation is also very dedicated to providing capacity building that is targeted at developing countries and least developed countries. We are starting, for instance, an e-commerce course now in the month of May that is targeted at these countries. And our idea is that these countries should be given information so they can more fully, comprehensively participate on international negotiations and discussions. But before getting to the GSI, I think that an important starting point to this discussion is that when GSI negotiations started back in 2019, the world was at a very different point. I'm sure that we all heard during the past year how the pandemic has accelerated digitalization, how it has accelerated the uptake of e-commerce. However, just only recently, the first reports produced by international organizations are coming through, showing that this uptake and this digitalization has been very unequal across the world. For instance, UNCTAD and WTO have pointed out how large-sized businesses have adapted much more quickly to the new scenario, and how they have already in place, when the pandemic started, well-developed e-commerce ecosystems that allow them to take advantage of the scenario in which everyone is moving to online and to e-commerce flourishing. At the same time, small and medium-sized enterprises were less able to scale up their processes to respond to this new scenario of online shopping, and the acceleration of e-commerce has significantly taken place mostly in developed countries and high-income developing economies. And all these reports, they are corroborated by the fact that if we take a look at the increase on internet usage across the world, we notice that in 2020, high-income countries have increased their use of the internet by almost 13%. At the same time, lower-income countries have increased their use only by 1%. Which shows that they did not have the conditions in place to migrate to the use of the internet and to take advantage of this new scenario. This is reinforcing divides that already existed before the pandemic. There are very good reports that have been published by the World Bank, the World Economic Forum in the last 10 years that show that we have a situation of great inequality. And this inequality has been worsened by the pandemics, not only among countries, but also within countries. And this is a problem that has been flagged in the report that has been published by the World Economic Forum in the beginning of the year. The WEF does an evaluation of the threats that we can see that would cause harm to our societies from an economic, from a democratic standpoint. And it was the first year in which issues of digital power concentration and digital inequality were ranked among the top 10 issues with regards to the likelihood of these global threats. So inequality will become a threat to global stability. This is not just a problem for developing countries only, this is a systemic problem. And if e-commerce is key to economic recovery, then the GSI and the negotiations in the WTO, they become strategic to ensure that these countries that have been more severely hit by the crisis, they can embrace e-commerce as a way to leverage their economic recovery as well. So I think that's when the negotiations started, development was already a concern, but now it's a much more important concern than before because global stability depends on that as well. But if we look at the GSI and the membership of the GSI, we are facing a diverse group, a group that corresponds to more than 80% of a global trade, as was mentioned before, a group that counts now with 86 participants, that does have the participation of 6 countries from Africa, 4 LDCs. So it is a diverse group that has the conditions to tackle many of the difficult problems that we face today to leverage e-commerce. However, there are many countries that do not participate in the GSI. And some arguments that these countries have presented not to participate, they vary a lot. I tried to map some of them, and some of them have come across in our courses. We offer our courses to diplomats, and these are some of the issues that they mention. First of all, many of them still see the working program on electronic commerce as the home for e-commerce discussions in the WTO. And this is the place in which the whole WTO membership is able to participate and to contribute, and they believe that discussions should be invigorated there at the first place. Secondly, they mentioned that there are some very important unresolved issues that need to be tackled first before we are in the condition to move forward to an agreement on e-commerce, such as the classification of services. Some argue that we need a new classification of new services in order to be able to have more clarity to regulate this field. Others mentioned that the principle of technological neutrality is not clearly defined, and there is the forever issue on whether electronic transmission should be regarded as goods or services, which has not been tackled as well. Many developing countries do not have regulation on the national level. So without this blueprint, it's very hard for them to advance their interests on the international level. They do not have any base to negotiate. And they do not want international regulations to constrain their policy space. If they do not have any regulation in place, they need to assess whether certain laws would be on their national interest or not, and they would want to have a blank page and full conditions to assess that. Some believe that there has been not a sufficient mainstreaming of development issues in the GSI. Some say that this is a development round, so there are other issues that have been in the agenda of the Doha rounds that have not been resolved that would have a much more serious impact on development, such as agriculture issues. The strength of negotiators in the WTO should be focused on these issues. And lastly, they mentioned that proposed e-commerce regulations at the WTO are advancing in fields which belong to internet governance, to digital governance, and that do not necessarily belong in the WTO. And data flows is one example of that. Data flows, they are everything in our life. So the data that flows on the internet does not only relate to goods and services, there are many other types of data circulating, and a provision on data flows would regulate data flows as a whole, therefore expanding the remit of the WTO to non-trade issues as well. And according to them, this is an issue of concern. At the same time, some developing countries have joined the GSI, so they see the reason to participate. And most of them say that there's already so many countries participating in the GSI that there is no way that this process is not moving forward, and they prefer to be rule makers instead of rule takers, and that the only way to mainstream development concerns is to be part of the negotiations. If you're not at the table, no one will hear your arguments. And at the same time, they argue that the fact that they do not have national regulations on some of these issues is not a handicap to participate. On the contrary, if they abide by laws on a multilateral level, this could provide them with a starting point to develop national laws. And this is a very good point, because it is a clear understanding of the function of the WTO. WTO is not there to regulate privacy, cybersecurity, or data flows in the nitty-gritty level. It will provide general principles, and the countries will regulate on the national level on the way that aligns with the international regulation, but they will have some space to decide what's best for them. And finally, some researchers have suggested that liberalization in some areas, such as data flows, they would benefit even countries that are less connected to the global flows of data today. So they would have spillover effects that would be positive for developing countries too. The documents that are produced in WTO negotiations, they are not public. There are proposals that have been tabled by Canada and New Zealand, for instance, to make these documents, at least the chair's summary, public in the sake of transparency. However, as was mentioned before, the last chair's summary has been leaked, so it is available online. At Diplo, we try to map the positions of some of the key players to try to understand in which areas developed and developing countries are focusing on. This is a comparison between the different areas in which these countries have tabled concrete proposals. It's interesting to see that among developing countries, Brazil has been a very active country. China is active almost all across the board, but it has been very silent in the section on openness and e-commerce. So it has not tabled proposals on data flows, although we know that China does have positions on data flows. It has agreed on data flows provisions with many exceptions in the RCEP. We see that the European Union, the United States, they are focused on openness and e-commerce. And of course, as was mentioned before, the European Union is also heavily engaged in telecommunications discussions. Here is a mapping trying to focus on the different areas in which developing countries have tabled positions. The first thing to notice is that developing countries have not, as a whole, been very vocal in these discussions, although some of them have, such as Brazil and China. But their proposals, they focus more on the first sections of the consolidated summary, enabling e-commerce. A lot of proposals have come through on trust and electronic commerce. It's interesting to see that developing countries are tabling many proposals on access to the source code because they see a concern that if they don't have provisions on this particular topic that would allow technology transfer, these negotiations could have a negative impact on the capacity of developing countries to ask for technology transfer as performance requirements. So they are focusing on that, and this is interesting from a development perspective. I believe that my time is up. That was a brief overview on how the different countries are positioning themselves, but I think that the final message is that the message from the beginning, which is that we do need to mainstream development issues on these negotiations in order to guarantee a fair and balanced result, and a result that would benefit us all and help us all to get out of the crisis that we find ourselves in. Thank you. Over to you.